1969, Alaska. What should have been a routine structural survey turned into something that still wakes me at night. I know how that line sounds. Dramatic, the kind of sentence that belongs to pulp paperbacks or late-night radio. I also know that when you sign your name on classified orders and they hand you a black envelope with a list of names and a warning, you become a witness whether you like it or not. My name is Ethan Ramirez. I was a sergeant in the Corps of Engineers back then. I went in to check cracks and load-bearing members. I came out with a secret that never left me. They called it Site Undefinido in the paperwork. On the forms they handed me at Fort Richardson, the mission was labeled a Structural Integrity Assessment Restricted. Colonel Marcus Hayes sat across from me, civilian dress, but the shoulders gave him away. He didn't smile. He pushed a manila folder across the metal desk, and when I opened it, there were blueprints, a handwritten note that an official map did not include the lower levels, and a list of personnel. 2 engineers, a security squad, a driver, a comms guy, Miguel Torres, and me, the sergeant who would keep everyone in line. There was also a scientist attached, Dr. Samuel Moreno, who wore the tired look of a man who had to justify everything he asked for. "Nothing outside that folder leaves this room," Hayes said. He said it like a law. His voice was dry, clipped. There was a rotary telephone against the wall and a harsh bulb over the desk. No photos, no unauthorized radio transmissions. You go in, you report structural anomalies, you do not speculate. You follow containment protocol, understand? We nodded. We always nodded. You learn to nod and obey. The orders were specific for 1969. Stripped to work clothes, no civilian cameras, all film and notes subject to inspection, respirators and cartridge filters for the lower chambers, analog dosimeters, and a small sealed chest of detonators that none of us were supposed to touch. There was also a roster for non-disclosure, stack of papers with official stamps and a line for your signature. I signed. So did Miguel, Javier Luna, David Ortega, and the others. You signed once, and part of you becomes accounted for on paper in a way that makes it easier for someone to deny you later. We flew north in a Huey at dawn. The rotor wash shredded the cold air into a white fog. Outside the chopper, the tundra looked endless and indifferent. Permafrost, scrub, a single unpaved road cutting toward a silhouette in the distance. The facility sat low in a bowl of rock, concrete like a stubborn tooth set into the earth. It had the kind of anonymity they taught us to spot. No signs, no markings, a perimeter fence topped with barbed wire, and a singly guard hut whose lantern burned like a lighthouse. The closer we got, the more the world seemed to silence itself. Even the wind went thin. They escorted us through a gate where a corporal checked our IDs against a paper list. Everything was analog. Stamped passes, clipped rosters, a thick logbook where the guard had written the time in block letters. We entered through an airlock in the concrete. The doors had rubber seals that smelled of oil and cold. The first chamber was a simple vestibule with tile floors, a radiator that hissed, and a sign that said, "Clean area" in faded stenciling. An orderly in a mechanic's jacket took our film canisters and handed back a receipt. "We develop and retain," he said. "No exceptions." If you're asking whether my head filled with alarms at that moment, it didn't. I was trained to do a job. The first hours were methodical and almost boring in their discipline. We walked blueprints with flashlights, tapped concrete with hammers, tapped load-bearing beams, logged stress cracks on clipboards, and measured vibration with analog meters. There was a sense of normalcy that made the later things stranger, the calm before the underside of the world opened. The lower levels were reached by an elevator that felt older than the rest of the place. It had 5 brass buttons, each labeled for a level. Someone in our group, Luna, usually the one to test the small, tense jokes, pressed what would have been an empty space with his thumb, because of course that was how the world sends you into the middle of a story. The light for the button didn't come on. When the doors closed, the elevator smelled like wet steel and somebody's tobacco. We went down. Air changes every time you go lower. The near-surface smells were oil and heated metal. Down below, the smell turned chemical and cold, a metallic tang like pennies rubbed across your tongue. They made us wear respirators with cloth cartridges because the lab notes said there was a refrigerant leak 2 decks below. The masks depressed the bones of your face in a way that made it hard to think in long sentences. You focus on short orders then. Check that gauge, close that hatch, keep the line. I remember the first anomaly as a detail rather than a revelation, a door that wasn't on any of our blueprints. It was set into a corridor we were mapping, access marked storage in a hand-painted sign. The corridor walls were ceramic and cold to the touch. Flickering bulbs overhead cast elongated shadows. When we tried the door, it resisted. It had no handle on the outside, only a heavy wheel on the inside with a plate reading "Authorized Personnel Only." That wheel was painted the same gray as the wall, and it looked like someone had tried to make it disappear. Dr. Moreno had a keyring. He checked the lock, tried some keys, then stopped and looked at the door as if it had told him something private. "Don't push past it unless you have to," Colonel Hayes had said in the briefing. "If you find something unlisted, flag it. We'll decide." We flagged it. The map we carried showed the facility at 2 levels, labeled Alpha and Beta, with maintenance galleries and refrigeration units. Our paper map did not show the chamber past the wheel. It wasn't negligence. Someone had deliberately left a blank. The unmapped passage opened into a shaft that felt like someone had carved a secret under the floor of the world. It was narrower, the air colder, and the hum in the walls had a pitch that sat in your molars. The hallway sloped down more steeply than anything above. The floor plate smelled faintly of copper and the black residue of old solder. There were rivets instead of welded seams, and the lighting was different. Not the soft incandescent bulbs of the surface, but a harsher white glow from tubes behind protective grills. At the end was an elevator unlike the one we took down. It had no markings and a small metal plate with hand-etched characters that none of us read. Luna ran his fingers over them and said nothing. We shouldn't have found it. We shouldn't have seen the ladder down into the maintenance crawl where a thin iron door led into a vault with a heavy round hatch. But we did. And when that hatch opened, we stepped into a room that didn't follow the rules of rooms. The first thing that hit me was the sound, a steady, low hum like a machine breathing. It wasn't the ventilation systems from above. It was internal, mechanical, and deliberate, the sort of sound you feel behind your teeth. The lights were dim. Red emergency lamps painted the place in a wash of bruised crimson. Rows of large cylindrical tanks lined the room, set in depressions like graves. Each tank was the height and girth of a small room, a thick reinforced glass viewing port at eye level, and piping that ran into the concrete floor like vines. The metal surfaces were painted a clinical white that had yellowed with age. On each tank, a small card hung from twine with a number stamped: Tank 3, Tank 7, Tank 12. Someone had written in block letters, "Do not open." We should have been technicians there to check welds and seals. Instead, our flashlights landed on the things inside. Not corpses, not tissue samples, living, dark silhouettes suspended in a viscous fluid. Their shapes were humanoid enough to trigger an involuntary recognition. Pair of shoulders, a torso, an impression of a neck and head, but elongated in ways our catalogs didn't include. Some were small as children, curled like regrets. Others filled the tanks with their length, limbs pooled like loose wire. The fluid refracted the emergency lights so that eyes couldn't be seen as eyes at first. They were dark mirrors reflecting our lamps. Every so often, a limb would shift as if testing the viscosity around it, like a hand pushing a curtain to see if it moved. We didn't touch the glass. We didn't know what we were allowed to touch. Dr. Moreno read the tags aloud in a voice that sounded like he was reading a phone book of ghosts. He had no laboratory arrogance in him then, just a between-sob kind of restraint. He clicked a pen shut and opened it again as if the sound would steady him. "Specimens," he said, and the word hung there like a verdict. Through the sampling port in the top of one tank, a narrow tube ran into a little console that kept clicking softly.
Beside it, an analog gauge bent toward the red, and a small paper strip chart recorded a slow, steady line like a heartbeat. A cathode ray tube monitor on a workbench fuzzed and then cleared, showing a patterned output. Nothing about it said experiment in a way that made sense. It said containment. It said maintenance. It said do not let them out. Then, in a small moment that sent the rest of the room falling inward on itself, one of the tanks rotated minutely on its mounts so that the silhouette inside faced the glass directly. It didn't flail, it didn't panic, it did something worse. It watched us. The moment an intelligence fixed on you, day-to-day motions sharpen. My fingers tightened on the clipboard until the paper creased. Miguel behind me made a sound that could have been a cough or the start of a prayer. The mask felt suddenly like an iron muzzle. The silhouette in Tank 7 lifted what might have been a hand and placed it against the inside of the glass. The palm there was long, with knuckles the size of marbles, and what would have been the sheen of fingernails looked like the edge of an obsidian shard. The creature's head tilted, not in curiosity so much as at a calculation. Its eyes, if those were eyes, traced the line of our respirator straps, the exposed hair on Miguel's temple, the braid of the cable that ran along my boot. It looked at me. You rehearse responses to danger in training. Take cover, return fire, follow the chain. You do not rehearse the collapse of your confidence in being unique. For half a breath I felt an echo of pity, an absurd, untimely empathy that made my throat close. This thing could not be a human being in any catalogued sense, and yet there it was, aware. "Don't make any moves," Dr. Moreno said, but his voice trembled. "Document, record, we have to document." We tried to be technicians. We took readings with Geiger counters that clicked with background noise and then steadied. The counters registered nothing extraordinary at the time, small fluctuations, more electrical interference than radiological fallout. The console printers clicked, producing thin, ribboned tapes we stuffed into evidence envelopes. I tried to take a photograph with the single 35mm camera they allowed me. It felt heavy in my hands. The shutter snapped like a judgment, and the moment fractured, a negative held in a packet that would later be developed and then, as I would learn, requisitioned. We moved along the row of tanks like men reading a cemetery. One of them, Tank 12, had condensation on the inside of the glass, clouding the silhouette. From inside there was a sound, a soft, human-like exhalation. For reasons I could not explain, the creature inside turned its head toward the ventilation grate above the tanks and banged its hand against the glass. The sound woke something in the room. Other tanks trembled, pipes vibrated, the small machines in the corners began a low, synchronous whine as if stirred by the same frequency. Luna put a hand on my shoulder. "Eyes on your clipboard, Sarge," he said quietly. His mouth was dry. The edges of his voice had the tremor you see in men who've been near death and decided to stay. We log, and we go. And for a little while, that's what we did. We logged. Dimensions of the tanks, gauge readings, serial tags, the number of specimens observed. We marked the door that had led us here with a piece of red tape so we could find our way back through the maintenance crawl. The tape fluttered in the draft like a small flag of surrender. We were not allowed to stay. Colonel Hayes's orders were precise. We secure any structural anomalies, note the discrepancies with official maps, and then vacate to allow specialized teams to assess biological safety. That made sense on paper. The truth of the basement was that specialized teams already existed on the other side of the perimeter, and their presence was the reason we had been shepherded in with so many warnings. Dr. Alan Cortez, a thin man with a cigarette that hung like a question mark, arrived an hour later with a small retinue and a larger authority. He had a soft voice that cut through others. "I need samples," Cortez said. He didn't ask if that made us uncomfortable. He said it the way a surgeon says, "make incision." Dr. Moreno looked at him like he was supposed to say no. He didn't. While Cortez and Moreno argued in low tones about extraction ports and sterilization, the facility did what old facilities do when stressed. Its systems responded. Alarms that had been intermittent became continuous. A red light above the main corridor flashed in a pattern none of us knew. And somewhere distant, a siren that had been asleep for decades began to wail like an animal. The cathode ray monitor on the nearest console jittered, then steadied on a readout that was not in any of our field manuals. A line on one of the strip charts spiked. The strip chart spike coincided with a different sound, the metallic clang of a latch being triggered somewhere deeper in the facility. We all turned as one. The hatch that led back to the maintenance tunnel, the one we had left with red tape, had been sealed. Where the door had been, there was now a seamless wall. That hadn't been there a half hour earlier. There are silences in those moments, the short exhale of men who know the world has shifted a tooth. The secure radio in our kit had a limited range and strict encryption. The base upstairs was out of range for all but a relay. Our field radio flicked with static.
Miguel frowned and tried the handset. Half his words came back as a jumbled mesh of static and someone else's breathing. "Lockdown protocol," someone said from behind us. The voice was through a field phone at the console, a high, clear voice. "Engineering, close main access, security sweep now." We were not told by who. Orders sometimes arrive in pieces. We had been cleared for entry. Now we were being ordered to stay put and wait. Everything in my training screamed against curiosity then. You stand clear. You let teams with names leave you cold. You do not poke at locked doors. But you also do not walk away from something that looks clearly alive. The two instincts warred inside me like children. And then the breach started. It wasn't a cinematic, large-scale event. Breaches in real life happen as a series of tiny fails. A valve sticks, a seal fails, an operator misreads a dial. In our case, it started with a small alarm on a maintenance console at the far end of the tank room. A light went from green to amber, and a small register began to click off a message that no one in the room could decode without the proper manual. One of the tanks, number unknown to me in that first breath, later I learned it was Tank 21, began to foam at the plug where a service hose attached. The fluid inside turned cloudy along the edges, and a lid on top vibrated as though something underneath were pushing. The first visible breach was not the tank exploding. It was the sound, a high-frequency, keening noise that made the respirator filters sting the inside of our ears. Miguel dropped to a knee and clutched his head. The light bleached white for a second, and we all saw it. From the corner of my eye, a seam in the floor plate cracked like a fault line. The maintenance crew, the ones who propped their lives between us and the unknown, sprinted toward the breach with crowbars and fire axes. Someone shouted, "Seal the drains," and bodies moved like a school under the pressure of a predator. I do not know how much time elapsed between the first alarm and full catastrophe. Time contracts in those rooms. We had tactically trained movements we couldn't perform because the facility was built to resist the wrong hands and the wrong assumptions. A door we needed to reach closed as if powered by a thought. The creature in Tank 7 beat against its glass again, and this time the sound broke cleanly, a succession of thumps that matched something in the upper levels. You began to realize containment could be both structural and cognitive. The tanks were designed not only as physical barriers, but as a way to keep something from reaching the rest of the facility's systems, and when those systems failed, the barrier between us and the unknown thinned like ice in spring. "I want everyone in the staging area now," Colonel Hayes's voice came through the field phone. He sounded almost old, the way men do when they're asking something of their children. A two-man squad moved through the tanks with handheld extinguishers, not to douse flames, but to spray at the seams, because the fluid itself had a vapor that made lights flicker. We filed out in a clumsy march, counts called by Javier Luna, who had a voice like a metronome. People tripped. Someone dropped a toolkit, and the clatter sounded obscene in that room of humming machines and alive silhouettes. We reached the stairwell up to a security corridor. The stairwell opened into a small security office where Dr. Cortez shouted into a landline and someone on the other end told him to evacuate all non-essential personnel. Non-essential meant anything without a rifle or a specific clearance. We were neither essential nor unessential. We were listed as engineers. The man on the wire said they were sending in containment teams with bayonets and live rounds if necessary. There was no moral clarity in his voice, there was only procedure. When we emerged onto the tarmac outside the facility, the sky above us was a hard, washed-out blue. The chill of the air slapped at our uncovered wrists, and we were led to a ridge a few hundred yards off where we were told to watch and report. From that vantage, you could see the concrete mouth of the facility. A column of gray smoke was rising, not from a conflagration, but from the emergency venting they opened to relieve pressure. The plant's generators coughed and then roared, spitting sparks that drifted like embers over the frozen ground. It was there, on that ridge, with my boots in the hard dirt and snow no more than a cold film underfoot, that we saw movement in the slope where the earth met the foundation. Something large moved under the step-down. The ground had been excavated in sections, reveals on the side that hinted at foundations that went deeper than the original drawings. The excavation equipment stood idle like a broken tongue sticking out of a mouth. Then another sound rose, not from the facility, but from the radio static, and a voice I would later learn was a general said a single, decisive word: demolition. I remember watching Dr. Moreno when that word arrived. The scientist crossed himself once, quick and private, as if he were bracing for a sacrament. Cortez looked like a man who had asked too many questions and now heard the answer in the form of an order. Colonel Hayes's jaw tightened into a rule. "We will secure the perimeter," he said. "We will evacuate non-essential staff. We will burn what we cannot remove." There are moments when your hands refuse the language of paper. I know now that what followed was as much a political decision as a military one, a choice to erase more than equipment. It was the sound of a world deciding to cover its own missteps with rubble. As our team huddled, the truth that had been growing like a shadow in the corridor settled into the center of my chest. They were going to destroy what they had been keeping. That was the second pivot, the moral fulcrum we couldn't step away from. A facility is bricks and cement and wire. A facility is also the sum of acts done inside. To blow one up was to delete the act, to remove witnesses, and to bury whatever else lived there under tons of earth. Orders were given in clipped phrases afterwards. Load into trucks, move to the staging area, remain under guard, surrender all film and notes for review. They fingerprinted our cameras, transferred negatives to a vault, and assigned 2 military lawyers to the debrief. That night, while we sat in the mess tent with thermoses of coffee gone tepid, Colonel Hayes explained in private what the general had said on the line. If what you're seeing can't be secured without unacceptable risk, it must be rendered inoperable. The phrase rendered inoperable was bureaucratic. It did not touch the human qualities I had seen reflected in thick glass. "Do you believe they were alive?" Miguel asked me at one point, lower than the noise of the tent. There were other questions lodged in him like splinters. He had been the one who'd first noticed the pattern on Tank 12, the condensation that suggested respiration. I could only tell him what I felt, that recognition had been mutual. The thing in the tank had looked back as if it knew what it was looking at. That knowledge meets you differently than fear. It meets you like a mirror. We were told to rest. We were told to be ready for the next day when the specialists would decide the extent of the demolition. We were also told to sign new non-disclosure statements, thicker, more binding, stamped with a non-standard insignia. They reassigned us quietly. New orders that took Miguel to comms duty at Fort Wainwright, Luna to a security post in a different theater, David Ortega to driver reassignment. Me, I was held for further accounting. It was a form of containment that wasn't physical. They scattered us like pieces on a board. That night, I lay on a cot and tried to sleep. Sleep is a muscle you learn to stretch thin in the Army. But memory often crawls through those thin places when you hope it will not. I thought of the long hand pressed to the glass. I thought of the way the creature's head tilted heading toward the vent. I thought of the spike on the strip chart, and the way the maintenance lock sealed itself while we watched. The tent smelled of gas and machine oil. Outside, the generator hummed in time with the memory. When they finally demanded our statements the next morning, we were separate. The debrief was a room with a metal table and a court reporter who typed with a metronome. A man whose rank was higher than a colonel, he didn't give me his name, walked in and read a list of regulations under which we were now to operate. They asked for our account and wrote it down. They said nothing of the demolition order on that first pass. They asked instead technical things, the serial numbers of tanks, the pattern on the glass, the readings from the Geiger counters. When I brought up the creature's awareness, the man with the higher rank scribbled something and said, "Noted." Later that afternoon, Colonel Hayes finally spoke plainly. He had pulled me aside and, in a voice that lacked the crisp edge of command, told me that charges would be placed at structural nodes and that the facility would be neutralized. He said neutralized with a neutrality that made my skin itch. He hesitated as if the words scraped his throat. "You were there," he said. "You saw things. You will be required to sign additional documents. For your own safety, do not speak of the operational specifics to anyone outside the roster." And then he looked at me in a way that made the world feel small and made known things feel smaller still. "You understand why," he said, not asking. I did. That understanding was a cold, rational thing to keep a man alive. It was also a moral question that didn't fit neatly into briefs. How do you teach a soldier to detonate a place that may have been a prison for things that watched and thought? How do you reconcile containment with conscience? How many hands do you allow the truth before it becomes a weapon? Those questions throbbed like an exposed nerve, and there was no easy way to bandage them. They took our film. They took our typed notes. They took our spoken words and filed them away under a bureaucratic label that meant file and forget. We signed papers that said we agreed to secrecy. We signed them with the same pens we used to note structural anomalies. The ink dried like a contract between us and the silence. There were rumors in the following hours. Specialized teams arriving, heavy equipment mobilized to dig, explosives requisitioned under covers of decommissioning. A convoy of trucks rumbled across the tundra. Men who had been quiet earlier took on expressions like people about to do surgery on a live being. Dr. Moreno kept to himself and stared at the horizon with a gaze I couldn't read. There was no public record of the events in any of the standard channels, and that absence was itself a presence. We assembled for one last sweep before the teams moved in. The tank room was colder than I remembered. The lights had been turned low, the emergency lamps now steady like watchfires. Some of the tanks had been tagged for removal. Others were sealed with metal plates bolted over the viewing ports. One of the plates had been torqued so tight the bolts looked fused. I leaned in toward the remaining open port and felt the same sensation as before. The cold, the hum, the impression of a presence curated and restrained. Then something I could not explain happened. The tall specimen, the one that had looked directly at me the first time, rose slowly in its fluid. It pressed both palms to the inside of its glass, and with deliberate force pushed itself up until its head was level with the rim of the tank. It wasn't a display of anger or of combat. It was an act of recognition and of address. The creature reached up as if pointing toward the ceiling, and then, with a movement so precise it felt planned, it raised one long finger and pointed outward at me. It was a gesture that made my skin slide the wrong way. Pointing is a human language. It's an assertion. That finger was not an accident. It was directed. I did not move. I could not move. The world shrank to the distance between a fingertip and my face.
The rest of the room buzzed with low voices, machines, and the careful movement of men who had traded in quiet absolutes for something decidedly unquantified. I felt an exposure that had nothing to do with my respirator. It was like being read aloud without consent. "Record it," Dr. Moreno whispered close enough I could smell his breath, the tobacco, and the acid of worry. He was not the scientist among us at that moment. He was a witness, sharing the terror of being known. "Do not let them say you never saw." That was the charge that would later be used against us, that we had seen and we had been asked to forget. That in itself becomes a wound. They moved into the facility the next day with more men and more equipment. We were shuttled back to the ridge. From the slope above the plant, we watched as crews set charges at key nodes. There were conversations about yield and collapse patterns, about making sure the blast would take out the lower levels. They argued about the risk of scattering debris that might be recovered, and someone with a voice like an executioner said, "We cannot take the risk of anything surfacing." I walked back to the tank room once more to make one final note. It was an impulse that was not wholly rational. I had a small piece of cotton paper in my shirt pocket and a pen. I wanted, for myself, to write the shape of a hand against the glass. I wanted to mark that the creature had pointed. I wanted to hold a record no one could deny. I slipped my hand into a glove and bent to the port of Tank 7. The glass was warm under my palm, which shouldn't have been. Warmth meant life, and the hand that had pointed was now resting and drifted faintly in the fluid like a ghost. "Don't linger," a guard said, and I straightened. Faces are difficult to read in respirators. They all look like asked-for apologies. As we boarded the transport that took us to a staging point further away, the word demolition repeated like an instruction not to look. People who had been in the room with us were reassigned to other posts. Paperwork started appearing in my hands like a rain of leaves. They rewired our lives. They replaced the names on rosters. They trimmed us like hedges. At dusk, the demolition teams moved into place.
I watched from a hillock with the rest of them, the black silhouettes of men against a cold sky. Teams with wire and charges worked in silence. They set their charges at seams that would buckle under the force and collapse inward rather than outward, they said, to control the spread. There was a military choreography to it, brutal and precise, as if they were preparing for surgery on a living thing they had decided to take apart. The final orders came down through a curt, clipped channel. We were not to approach once the charges were set. We were to be accounted for. We were to sign another set of papers acknowledging that we had been present. There was no room for witnesses beyond the roster. I stood with Miguel and Luna and Ortega on the ridge. Miguel's hands shook as he held a flask to his mouth, though he only pretended to drink. Luna lit a cigarette and let it glow, then snuffed it. David Ortega's jaw was clenched like a vice. He spat in the dirt. The light on the horizon turned a flat, hostile color as twilight took hold, and the facility at our feet became an impression carved into the snow. When the detonators went live, there was a pattern of small pops that I would, in memory, conflate with the sound of bones. There was no single glorious boom like in the movies. The charges were calculated. The structure failed inward, floors pancaking into one another, vents shearing off, girders folding into bowed ribs. Concrete splintered. A plume of dust licked the sky higher than the crater I imagined would be the final line. For a moment you could have believed the place had simply fallen asleep. For a moment the ridge was silent and the world breathed in and held. Then the dust cleared enough for me to see the rim of a hole where once had been a door. The hole didn't look complete. It looked like a wound that would scab over. I found myself thinking of hands again, of a hand pointing, of hands that pressed against glass. There was a human vice in the compulsion to know how things end. We had watched machines lay waste to what they were ordered to obliterate. But the thought that something might not be destroyed with concrete nagged like frost under a blanket. We were told to disperse. We were told that this was for our own safety and the security of the nation. We were told to return to our posts, to forget daily details except those required for official reports, to hand off any film and notes. We signed. The ink was smooth and cold, and for a heartbeat afterward, I wondered whether my signature would be enough to smother my own memory. That night in my bunk, I turned the little negative print from my pocket between gloved fingers. The image showed nothing more than a smear of light and shadow, a silhouette blurred by the limits of film and low light. It could be dismissed. It could be explained away. The rational mind can find ease in ambiguity, but the gut holds the clarity of a different kind of evidence. The pause in a man's voice when he says, "rendered inoperable," the way a scientist crosses himself before a demolition, the density of a gaze from something behind glass that recognizes you as a being and chooses, in that recognition, to single you out. The papers they gave us were thick with red stamps. They included new orders, reassignment notifications, and something that looked like a permanent change of status for some of the specialists. There were no photographs in the press. There were no local reports. There were rumors that the public record would show an accidental industrial fire at a remote maintenance facility that had been decommissioned years before. Rumors are how absence speaks. They sent me home not long after. They gave me a discharge that cited a mixture of reasons, none of them complete. They called it administrative. They put a note in my file about unresolved stresses related to confined space operations. I didn't talk about it. You learn quickly to measure what stays in the world and what goes into the private ledger of the self. But some things do not stay shelved. They echo. I keep the negative in a small envelope that occasionally finds its way into the glove compartment of my truck when I forget to remove it. Sometimes, at night, I cut the corner of the paper with a blade and hold it up to the light until a dark suggestion of form emerges. Sometimes I think it's proof of nothing, and sometimes I think it's proof of everything. There is a moral slope to all of that, to keep, to hide, to remember. Each weighs heavily in its own way. Several months after they called the site neutralized, a notice appeared in a quiet channel that only someone with close clearance could find. It said the facility had been decommissioned and controlled demolition executed under classified protocol, and then it ended with a case number that connected to no public court. The words were careful. They were designed to soothe. They didn't ask the hard question. Was anything else destroyed, or simply burrowed deeper? Sometimes in the middle of the night, I imagined fingers moving under earth. I imagined structures shifting and something small and deliberate finding a new cavity to press its palm against. I wonder about the ethics of sealing away life when life looks back and recognizes you. I wonder if they planned for that. After the charges, the world went back to its measured grooves as if nothing had been torn out of it. The tundra healed in the arithmetic of snowfall and wind. The drill rigs were packed away. Men who had been there with us were posted to new duties as if the earth itself had a memorandum to which it had to answer. The paperwork crept in like ivy. More forms, supplemental signatures, a thick envelope stamped classified that I carried to my barracks like an accusation. There are bureaucracies designed to make absence official. They excel at it. If this kind of thing matters to you, if you want to hear more accounts scrubbed from records, subscribe. That's the modern phrase, I suppose. Back then, there was only the word witness, and the expectation that witness silence can be ordered into habit. They watered down our lives with small, telling procedures. Every week for months, a lieutenant called me to the administration hut and handed me new orders in typewritten sheets, each one more restrictive than the last. They wanted my statement, then another, then a clarification. They required that I surrender the film negatives and sign a receipt for their chain of custody. The camera that had weighed so heavy in my hands felt dead when they took it. The negatives went into a vault labeled with an index number that led to nothing public. Men who'd been in the specialist teams vanished into other divisions. Dr. Cortez was reassigned to an academic post under auspices that read as promotion. Dr. Moreno took leave and then returned to a position that had him working isolated shifts at a testing site in the interior. Colonel Hayes said, without theatricality, that the matter would be contained administratively, and that any questions to the press would be directed to an office in Anchorage, an office that never placed a call. They taught us secrecy the way they taught us to march, repetition until it becomes reflex. The first NDAs they handed out were forms I could not, then, fully parse. Legalese is a kind of armor. It wraps you and says you belong now to a story someone else will tell. They stamped the documents with a seal whose design they would not discuss. My signature on those pages felt less like consent and more like being logged. I remember the ink drying and the absurd thought that a smear of handwriting could weigh more than the memory of seeing a hand pressed to glass. People do strange things when they are told to forget. Miguel went home and took to sleeping on his father's floor for several nights, as if proximity to family could press down the thing that had watched him. Luna drank more than a man should, and yet stopped when a sergeant from his new post wrote to say that he had been seen weeping in the latrine. David quieted to an almost criminal muteness. He would only say that the way the tanks had been bolted shut was the worst kind of machinery, a false kindness that pretended to keep things safe by pretending not to be there. As for me, I learned the outline of a life that could fit in the margins. Work, a rented room in town, a mailbox I checked with the dull, private curiosity of someone who is always waiting and never for a letter that will relieve him. Dr. Moreno, for a time, became the axis of my unease. He would come to the mess tent sometimes and sit with his coffee like a man at the edge of a cliff, hands wrapped around a disposable cup as though it were a talisman.
He did not make small talk. Once, under dim lights that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cleaning solvent, he told me something in a voice that sounded like he had ground his teeth with every word. "They asked me to certify the readings as stable," he said. "They gave me graphs and asked me to sign them as if signing would make them true. If a man writes a line long enough on paper, they imagine it becomes a law." "Did you sign?" I asked, because there are moments when a man must know whether another will share his burden. He nodded. I signed. I signed because a signed note can sometimes keep a man alive. I didn't sign because it was true. He left not long after that conversation for the interior. The official reason was consultation. The unofficial reasons are whispered now among the few of us who still know the name of the site. He wrote one letter to a colleague expressing ethical reservations that read like a plea, and then the letter vanished into channels that make concern discreetly disappear. Years later, I heard he had been placed on a long-term project that paid well and asked less of him in terms of public scrutiny. He stopped calling. Sometimes I dream about him. Dreams like that have their own syntax, corridors without end, a constant low hum that a whistle of frost at the window cannot banish, soft tapping at the glass that is at once a message and a question. In the dream, Dr. Moreno stands in a white coat that has seen better days and looks at me with the exhausted solemnity of a man who has made peace with things he should not have known. "Remember," he says in the dream, "remember what you saw. Do not let them make you a signatory of forgetting." Memory and paper are strange companions. I kept my negative, the one that shows only a smear and a suggestion of a silhouette, in a small envelope in the glove compartment of my car. It was a private rebellion. Sometimes I would take it out and hold it to the light in a mechanic's parking lot and let the smear redden into a face in the uncertain way only film can provide. At other times, the envelope sat undisturbed for years, until the glove compartment's cold grew familiar enough to be another layer of silence. People ask why I didn't try to tell the story to the press, why I didn't take the negatives and walk into the offices of whatever newspaper would print it. The answer is always the same. You do not understand the economy of danger in such a world until you have been priced into silence. Men in suits and men with little brass pins come to you with the courtesy of predators. They promise protection. They offer you an out. They explain the broader stakes in language that smells of paper and iron. This would threaten national security, they say. You could implicate men who know nothing of what you saw. They add a clause about the safety of the public. They hand you forms. They remind you that a signed agreement is a contract with consequences.
An ordinary man trembles at the thought of consequences for family, for marriage, for a future he could no longer buy. I weighed the ledger and made the choice that a lot of men in my position make, the choice to keep the memory for myself and the people who were with me. It is not a noble choice, and I do not mean it to be. It was an act of cowardly calculus dressed in the clothes of prudence. I told myself that secrecy could be a kind of mercy, that if we were to be quiet, at least the creatures we'd seen would not be trotted out in parades of examination. It's a poor consolation. Time erodes some things and calcifies others. The legal constraints eased around us like a breath fading. My reassignment to a warehouse squadron in town gave me a routine. I married, briefly, to a woman whose patience was saintly and whose skepticism I could never fully meet. We had a child. The child put his small hand against my palm one night and asked why I woke up gasping sometimes. I made small noises and told him stories about the Arctic wolves and how boots sink in snow. I did not tell him about the way certain eyes had traced the line of a respirator strap. That secret lodged between us like a small rock in a boot. A couple of years after the demolition, there were reports, small, easily ignored, that a crew had found an unmarked cavity in the bedrock near the original site during a geological survey. The report was classified at a level I couldn't read, but the phrase anomalous subterranean voids was enough to keep me awake for nights. There were rumors that a sinkhole had appeared in a ravine a few miles out and that the army had had to pay locals quiet sums for missing equipment. It's how silence operates, not through absolute absence, but through a scatter of gestures meant to distract. When you see a man in a trench coat step into a diner and tilt his head as if listening to static, you begin to believe in patterns. I received once a small parcel without a return address. Inside was a length of cable, something with a braided copper core, corroded as if buried, and a folded scrap of paper with a single line in a hand that might have been Miguel's. Keep the negative. I sat on my kitchen floor with the lamplight pooling like a guilty puddle and thought of the finger. The note was a rebuke and a prayer. Occasionally, years later, I would hear from the others in terse, coded ways. Miguel sent a postcard with a picture of a harbor and the single word "alive" penned crookedly across the back. Luna's brother slipped me a cigarette packet at a reunion and said Luna was "getting help" without elaboration. David called once and we agreed to meet for coffee. He arrived with hands the color of cold steel and eyes I didn't know how to comfort. He nibbed at a sandwich and kept watching the door as if waiting for someone who might unlock it with a special smile. We didn't speak of the tank room then. We had learned that the real danger of the secret wasn't the thing itself, but the way it rewired men. If the facility had housed specimens that were conscious, what did the demolition mean? We framed the act in mechanical terms: remove the hazard, prevent exposure. But the moral question, if it can be called a question, gnawed at me. We destroy in order to prevent harm. We also destroy to prevent discovery. To demolish was to choose forgetfulness as policy. To bury was to pretend there had been no hands to press against glass. Who has the right to decide that an intelligence is better sealed than understood? People who have never stood near such choices find it easy to recite the policy: containment, deny, neutralize if necessary. They cite words like protocol and containment failure and think the argument closed. But a protocol is only as moral as the people who design it. I think often of the tall specimen that looked at me. It pointed.
That gesture has remained as emphatic as a slap. It did not make a plea I could translate. It made an assignment. It meant something to someone. It meant perhaps that it saw me as a ledger in which to leave a mark. The indelible part of the event was not the hum in the walls, nor the way charges crumpled concrete. It was being singled out by a life I had no language for, and then being asked, perhaps, to carry that out of the room. Time did not heal this so much as tasted the wounds into different forms. I had a series of small health complaints the doctors labeled as stress-related. A hearing that sometimes catches a high-pitched tone in an otherwise quiet room. A pressure behind the eyes when it rains. A compulsion to check under beds in motels long after I have left. The Army's psychologists prescribed patience and later reassignment. The effect of it all is that memory finds its own camouflage. You learn to tuck the uncomforting details into habits that look like ordinary life. Every now and then I visit the old area, which is what an addict does to the scene of his crime. There is nothing to mark where the concrete used to be. No sign, no commemorative plaque. There's the drift of winter and the iron smell when thaw comes. I drive out sometimes with a thermos, park, and listen. The sound that returns is wind and distant insect noise in warmer months. Once I thought I heard the hum, but it was only a generator on a distant construction site. I have learned to be cautious of the way the mind gifts you blessed mishearings. There was another incident, years later, that I can't make tidy with rational explanation. A man, no insignia on his coat, no call sign, only a thin paper badge with an expiration date odd enough to be suspicious, approached me at a gas station in a small town where I'd stopped to buy cigarettes. He asked my name casually and then produced a photograph that had been taped into a worn leather wallet. It was a Polaroid of a ridge and a blur that might have been a plume of dust. He slid it across the counter like a man who slides a note across a table in bad humor. "You were at Site Undefino in '69?" he asked, as if the question needed to be asked. My mouth answered before my brain could calibrate. Yes. He nodded slowly. "They want to keep you comfortable," he said. He made the comfort sound like a bribe. "You keep what you keep. You don't speak of it, they will monitor. You'll be safe." "Who are you?" I asked. He shrugged. "You don't want to know," he said. He folded the photograph back into his wallet and left. I thought of the finger pointing and felt suddenly that the photograph's smear could mean anything. An image is only as dangerous as the story attached to it. I will not say the man's name. I will not allege that he worked for any agency. He likely did. He also might have been clerical staff or the manager of a small armored truck company. That ambiguity is the architecture of secrecy. Men with badges and men without them are both useful to the same ends. As the years pile under my belt, people stop asking me for the specifics because they assume the action belongs to another era. It's convenient. It allows them to nod and tell themselves that the world is a rational place. It allows me to avoid explaining why certain sounds at night startle me and send me back into the memory of a glass face pressing against a portal. The negative in my glove compartment has a patience. I take it out sometimes and look at the edge of what it claims to show. It supplies me with a material anchor to memory. It also gives me the small, unsober pleasure of keeping a thing the system wanted removed. There were later, quiet excavations, permits filed under odd company names, contractors with too many armored pallets of equipment, a man in a hard hat who asked friendly questions about permafrost thaw rates. Once, a crew found a seam in the bedrock and pulled out a length of tubing that had been corroded in place. They boxed it and took it away with no public fanfare. You learn to read that behavior as you learn to read wind. Certain small ripples tell you a storm was nearby. Moral responsibility, in my mind, has no law that can weigh it adequately. The men who issued orders did it with the lightness of men who have been taught to see trade-offs as arithmetic. They balanced lives and hypothetical futures and social stability in a ledger and made a choice. They authorized a demolition as if erasing a problem of infrastructure. The ethical residue is not theirs alone. It sits on the shoulders of the men who carry the memory, of the engineers who engineered nothing but paperwork afterward, and of the scientists who were asked to certify absence. I have tried to hold a private audition of my conscience. If the situation ever returned to daylight, what would I do? Would I shout? Would I hand the negative to someone with a press pass and watch the world divide like old bread?
Or would I stand mute while the machinery of silence clicked back into place? So far, I have been a man who stores questions in the dark. And yet, sometimes I search for an opening, a crack in the pavement where light might get through. Not to expose the world to spectacle, but to let a small, necessary moral fact exist in the realm of public scrutiny. There are nights when I wake convinced of a sound under the house, like something pushing through soil. Once, my son, grown now, with a life that does not intersect with mine in easy ways, called me from a city 3 states away. He told me about a sinkhole that had opened near a highway where he hadn't been. He spoke about engineers and how they bunched their fingers over maps. I listened and knew nothing in particular. The world is endless with natural phenomena. But I pictured, as I always do, a hand pressing against an earthen pane, a finger pointing. Sometimes the finger points at you because it recognizes you as the one who remembers. Other times, perhaps, it points to warn. The last time I went out to the old place, a winter had made the land into a white grave of forgiving snow. I stood on a slight rise and watched birds track the thermals. Someone had placed a survey marker far from where the structure had been. A laminated sign said simply, "Site under controlled monitoring." The sign looked like a liar's altar. I ran my glove along its edge and left a smear of cold oil. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard the faintest mechanical hum, a frequency underneath the wind, so low it could have been the sound of the earth remembering itself. There are people who believe the truth is an expanding force, that if something is concealed long enough, it cannot help but bubble to the surface. There are others who think secrecy breeds reality in the way rot breeds mold. I hold neither certainty nor prophecy. I hold instead the conviction that watching something alive and then deciding to remove it is a moral act that demands accounting beyond the stakeholders' budgets and briefs. Sometimes I imagine a future technician with a flashlight stepping into a cavity and feeling for a wheel painted the same gray as the wall. Maybe they'll find nothing but packed snow and rust. Maybe they'll find a bolted plate that hasn't been pried up, or a frayed cable pointing into darkness like a question. Maybe they'll look through a seam and see, with the same shock that once anchored me in a room of tanks, a palm pressed to a porthole of sediment and a slender, deliberate digit pointing at the assembly of humankind like a man tapping his watch. If that day comes, if someone else finds what we left unspoken, I want them to be ready for the ethical work it will demand. To excavate is a responsibility. To uncover is to remit testimony. To claim ignorance when you were told is not innocence, it is choice. I keep writing this down because memory refuses to remain a private error. Maybe because writing forces me to give the thing a name, and names are the only tools we have to stake a territory in the moral landscape. Maybe because the finger that pointed at me expected an answer I have not yet given. To anyone who hears this and thinks it is pulp, believe that if you must. To those who remember a hum under their floorboards or a light that does not belong to ordinary wiring, believe your senses. To those who hold power and think the safe path is erasure, I would tell you this. You cannot delete the act of seeing. You can only move it into darker files. If you have come this far and you believe the story bears repeating, subscribe to channels that preserve witness testimony. Keep an eye on declassified files when they emerge. Follow traces, not promises. I will close not with an explanation, because I don't have one worth the weight of the word, but with what I have been given by the thing that looked at me. The knowledge that some of our choices are not purely tactical. They are moral weights worn on the body. I carry mine like a metal plate under the ribs. When the wind is right on cold nights, I still think I hear a fingertip tapping a glass somewhere beneath the soil of Alaska, making deliberate contact with the world above. The site is still indefinito in the records available to the public. In my bones, it is not finished. The last thing the Talmud did before they sealed the tanks and bolted the plates was to choose me with a gesture I could not interpret as either threat or benediction. Alaska, 1969. I was there. I signed the papers. I watched the structure fail inward. I stood on a ridge and watched dust bloom into a crater. I keep the negative, and sometimes I hold it to the light and imagine it blooming into a face. They told me to forget. I didn't. Someday someone will dig. When they do, I hope they remember not to bring only instruments and explosives, but philosophy and law and mercy. If a life looks at you and recognizes you, do not erase it for convenience. That is my account. It is my testimony, as classified and as fragile as the paper that bound my signature to silence. I do not claim it as proof. I claim it as a witness's obligation. If you found this account compelling and think others should hear it, subscribe and look for the related declassified files we've linked. There are more testimonies. There are more nights when witnesses awake with the hum in their bones. Keep watch.